Hello and welcome back to Humanizer, where I'm converting the open source MPFB 3D character creator from the Blender plugin into Go.4. So this is part 3 of automatically importing the clothing. So now I have it all working where you'll move the texture files, then make the material resource, then convert the GLB to mesh, and finally generate the closed mesh with all of the shape keys. So these first 3 work on all of the files, but then the generate closed mesh is individual. And next time I'll be testing the efficiency of pre-generating the clothing shape keys versus just generating the single shape that you need at runtime per character. So because the file sizes of the meshes are a problem for my GitHub, but also I don't want to run out of RAM when you run the game. So I've uploaded this to the repository, and now I'll show you how I got it to work. So last time I attached the generated clothing mesh to the skeleton. So now you can see that it works with the animation player from the skeleton builder. Now I need to import the texture. So I'll need to parse the mhmat file, which is short for make human material. So you can see it has references to all of the PNG files that we'll need to create the material resource. So first I'll make a mhmat reader like I did for the mh clothing. So I'll create a new script in the closegen for the mhmat reader. This extends the resource, and I'll set the class name, and then I'll initialize with the file name like I did in the mh clothing reader. Then I want to loop over all of the lines in the file, so while file get position is less than file length, get the file.getLine. And I'll just print the line for now. Then in the GLB to mesh file, I'll make a new variable for the mh material equals mh matReader.new, and then I'll pass the file path to the MPFB2 plugin folder, which I have copied locally into the project. And then I'll just change the extension to mhmat instead. So now if I run this, it should print out the contents of the mh material file. So you can see that in the output. And first, I want to get rid of all of the commented lines, so those have the £sign. And first, I'll go ahead and comment out the rest of the ready function and just set the shape key data to an empty dictionary for now, so I can run this faster for testing. So first, I'll make sure that the line does not begin with a number sign. So, and the line does not equal an empty string. Then print the line. So now if I run this, the GLB to mesh, now we have all of the data values without the comments or empty lines. So for most of the values, the first word is the variable name, and then the remaining is the value associated. However, for the shader param and shader config, you can see that this has two variable names and then the value after. So this will need to be a nested dictionary. So I'll go ahead and make a new empty dictionary for the data. And then on the init, I'll set the data dot shader config to an empty dictionary and the shader param. So now when I get the line, I'll set the variable name equal to the line dot get slice, set the delimiter to a space and the slice to 0, and I'll print the variable name instead of the line. So here you can see that the first word is printed, and they're all different except for the two that we've already identified. So I want to check if the variable name equals shader param or shader config. So if it doesn't, it will just be a normal variable, and I can set the data at the variable name equals line get slice space and then 1. So I'll have it print out the data. So now we have all of the normal variables added to the data dictionary, and you can call them by using their dot name. And if the first variable is shader param or config, then set the data variable name at line get slice equals line get slice 2. So this will get the first word after the shader config and then set the value to the remainder. So if I run this, now you can see that the shader config and shader param have also been filled in with all of their variables. Next, I want to make the material, but first I'll add the input and output folder variables. So the input is the MPFB2 plugin assets, and the output is the generated assets. And then when I pass the file name, I'll get rid of the input folder, so it's just the closed path. And so the input folder, I'll add the file name base directory, which will be up to the file name, so the additional folder. And I can use the path join, which will handle the slashes. And I'll do the same with the output folder. And then here I can pass the input folder dot path join file name get file. So I'll just run this again to make sure it didn't break anything. So now we have the input folder working. Then I'll make a new function to make the material resource, or just make material. And I'll need to make a new variable for the new material as a standard material 3D. And then I can use the resource saver to save the new material at the output folder, path join default material dot resource, and then actually I want to set the save path. And then return the save path so that I can load the resource from the path in the GLB to mesh. So I'll set the material path equal to mhmat make material. And if I run this, now in the generated assets folder, I have a blank default material. So now I want to set the service material in the GLB to mesh. So I'll set the export mesh, set material on surface 0 to load material path. And now if I run the GLB to mesh again, so it does take a bit longer because it has to load the shape key data. but now the mesh is using the material that it was generated. Now to set the texture, which is the albedo texture, I'll need the diffuse.png from the plugin folder, and in the MH material file, this is under the diffuse texture. So I'll check if diffuse texture is in the data, and I'll make an input path from the input folder, join the data diffuse texture, and the out path equal to the output folder, path join data diffuse texture. And then I'll use the directory access copy absolute from the in path to the out path. And finally set the new material albedo texture equal to load the out path. So now if I run the GLB to mesh, the texture has been added to the outfit, and most of the clothing will have a normal map as well. So this is the normal map texture. So I'll check if normal map is in data, then set the in and out path and copy the image, and then I need to set the new mat. So if I open this, there's the normal map. First it needs to be enabled, so I'll set normal enabled equals true, and then I'll set the normal texture equals load the out path, and I'll set the normal scale equal to the normal map intensity. And this will be a string, so I'll go ahead and cast it as a float. And you do have to run it twice because it seems like you need to import the image for it to work. So I'll have to separate this into two separate scenes, but I'll do that in a bit. So now you can see that it has more shading on it, and that's from the normal map. So if I open the resource, now this is enabled with the texture. And currently the cull back is enabled, so I will want to disable the cull mode as well. So this is an issue for the skirt in particular. The whole inside is transparent, so I want to set the new material coal mode equals coal disabled. And this outfit also has the AO.png, which is the ambient occlusion. So I'll get the AO map texture, get the input and output path, and then I'll set the ambient occlusion enabled equals true. AO enabled. And then I'll set the AO texture and the AO light effect, I believe, is the intensity. So now I'll run this again, the GLB to mesh. So now I want to run the converter for all of the files at once. So I need to move the texture PNGs first. So I'll need to break this into its own function. So move texture files, and so I can move the directory access call from the make material. And the reason for this was I was having to run the GLB to mesh twice, or the make material, because it needs to run the import on the new image before it can set it in a material. So basically the image didn't exist yet because it was all run at the same time. So you need to run this in a separate scene first, let it move all the images, and then run the make materials. So now this is in a separate function. And then I'll make a new scene in the closegen folder to move the texture files. And so I'll name this 01 move texture files, so you'll know this is the first scene to run. And then I'll attach a new script, and so I'll want to loop over the input directory and I'll set the input directory to the mpfb2 assets folder. And I'll want to append the input directory and join it with the path. And if it finds so if there's a nested directory, then call dir contents on the path and join it with the file name. Otherwise, if the file name get extension equals mhmaterial, then print the file name, and on ready, I'll call the directory contents on an empty string, so it will start in the assets folder. So if I run this, so it found all of the mhmaterial files in the input folder. So that's good. Now I want to process them and move the PNG files. So I'll make a new function to move the texture files, and this will take a path, and I'll make a new mhmaterial reader and pass the path, and then call the mhmat move texture files function, and then when it finds an mhmat file, I want to call the move texture files with the path join file name. So now if I run this, and it'll have to re-import all of the PNGs. So I'll let it finish that. And now once it's done, I can see in the generated assets folder, now it has moved the PNG files into the output directory. And now I can run the glb to mesh, which I renamed with a 02 at the beginning, so you know to run it after the move texture files. So if I change the closed path, which has to be relative to the generated assets folder, but if I change it to the shoes1.glb, and then take out the input folder, and if I run that, it should generate the mesh resource and attach the new texture. So I now have a shoes1.resource, and if I reset the transform and then attach it to the skeleton 3D, you can see that the shoes now line up with the animation. So that's the process for converting the clothing from the GLB to the OBJ file. So I thought I would be able to just loop over all of the GLB files, but there's still some issues. So if I set the close path to the Fedora cocked and run that, it will throw an error because it can't find the make human material file. And that's because, as you can see, the object file is Fedora cocked, but the make human material file is just Fedora. So basically I'll need to look for the material files and create the default material in this folder, and then I'll just point the mesh.material to the default material in the GLB to mesh instead of passing the absolute file name of the mhmat file here. So I'll need to make another scene to run after the move texture files. So this will be the make material resources, and I'll save this in the close gen as the second step and attach a new built-in script. So I want to loop over the input directory like I did in the move textures, and I'll look for the MH material files. And instead of moving the textures, I'll make the material and I'll still need to make a MH material reader, but I'll call the make material function on the MH material. So now if I run the make material resources, so it didn't throw any errors, and it looks like it's trying to re-import the resources. And now I can see in the file browser that it has generated all of the default materials for the assets in the generated assets folder. So now all of the objects should have their material, and I'll be able to set it in the GLB to mesh. And now in the GLB to mesh, instead of setting the material path to the MH material make material, I'll set the material path to the generated assets plus the close path base directory, and then join path default material dot resource. So now if I try to generate the cocked fedora mesh again, you can see that it doesn't throw an error this time. And if I go to my test skeleton and add the newly generated resource mesh, so you can see that it has the texture on it. And if I reset the transform and attach it to the skeleton, so now it follows the animations as well. So that all seems to be working. Now I want to generate the meshes for all of the GLBs. So I'll need to loop over the generated assets folder. So I'll rename the ready function to process clothing, and I'll add the directory contents function to loop over the generated assets folder. So I'll set the input directory to generated assets, and then instead of moving the texture files, I'll process clothing, and I'll set the clothes path to the file name. And we're looking for the GLB instead of mhmat. So now on ready, I can call dir contents on the empty string. And I need to set the close path to the file name joined to the path. So now if I run this, it's going to start throwing errors. So the first issue is it says invalid index of 3 on the array. So if I hover over the line array, I can see that it's 0, 0 with 2 values. So this is correct. There is no line array at 3. So if I look at the line, it's material shoes6.mhmat. So basically, once I get to the verts 0, I change the current section to the vertices, and I can see that the issue is in the shoes6 mhclothing file. So I have that open, and you can see that there's 2 lines here, material and vertex bone weights, which this might be important, but I'm just going to ignore it for now. So essentially, I just want to make sure that the line has 9 floats in it. So I'll check to make sure if the line array dot size equals 9, then process the line. Otherwise, I'll print the line, which may help me with debugging later. So now if I run it again, this time it'll throw a different error. And that's because it can't find the mhclothing file. So it's looking for fedora.mhclothing in the Fedora 1 But if I check that, you can see that the MH clothing name is Fedora01, and it was looking for Fedora because that's what the object is named. So I'll need to add a function to the GLB to mesh to find the appropriate MH clothing file. So in the GLB to mesh, I'll add another function to find MH clothing, and this will need to loop over the directory contents. So this will take a absolute path, and it'll get the path base directory. So this will be the containing folder, and we'll check if it found a file. So we'll ignore the directories, and if the file name get extension equals MH clothing, then return the path joined with the file name. And now in the process clothing, I'll make a new variable for the MH clothing path equals find MH clothing from the input directory plus the clothes path. And I'll set the MH clothing reader equal to a new clothing reader from the path. So this should work now. So the base get baster has 2 underscores in it, and I want to return the path.getBase directory joined with the file name, and then I want to use the npfb2 plugin assets for the close path. So now if I run this, it should throw a different error. But you can see that it does get through quite a bit more of the process. So this time the issue is that it can't find the MH clothing for the male 1591, and so that's in the proxy meshes, and there is no MH clothing or MH mat because it's not a clothing. So I may want to use these proxies at some point because there's less vertices, so it would be more efficient. But for now, I'm just going to ignore the proxy meshes folder. So in the directory contents, if the current directory is a folder and the file name does not equal proxy meshes, then I'll try to run it again. So now the issue is it's trying to get a Blender ID that's not in the B2G index, and the file is the Bob2 haircut. So basically that means that there's duplicate vertex positions in the Bob2 haircut, and this is actually a problem for most of the hair, as I found out. And it's definitely a problem. It will mess up the mesh generation for the hair, but for now I'm just going to ignore it. So I'll just check if the Blender ID is less than the Blender to go.index.size, and then add the new bone weights. Otherwise, I'll just print out the missing vertex ID and the close path so I know which ones aren't working. And this will be a problem in the make basis as well. So I'll just check again that the ID is in the Blender to go.index. But now if I run it, it shouldn't throw any errors, but you will see that most of the hair are missing vertexes. So basically I'm going to need to revisit my Blender to go.indexer to account for duplicate vertices, which I knew was potentially going to be a problem, but as you can see, it's missing quite a few. But it did run without throwing any errors, so that's good. So for example, on the animation, you can see, you've already seen that most of the clothing generates correctly, but for the ponytail, the faces are definitely not connected correctly under the base of the hair and to the ponytail. That should be there should be a cutout there essentially. So if I reset the transform and attach it to the skeleton though, so it does still follow the head around, it just doesn't look very good. So I need to figure out basically how to account for the duplicate vertices, and hopefully I'll be able to fix that. Otherwise that's going to be a big problem later. So, but the rest of the clothing does work, and like the eyebrows and stuff. So these will be added to the character separately as well. If I set the skeleton, you can see that the eyebrows are moving around. So that's all good. Next, I want to be able to add the clothes to the clothes demo, but if I just add the cocked fedora to the clothes maker, it doesn't have the blend shapes, so it's not going to change, although it does attach to the skeleton at least. As expected. So now I need to make the clothes generator work with the new generated assets. So in the generate clothes mesh. So first of all, I'm looking for the import mesh.resource, and I could look for the actual resource name, which is the clothes name, but I think it'll just be easier to name the mesh import mesh in the GLB converter. So instead of the clothes name .resource, I'll save it as import mesh.resource, and I'll run that again. So now it'll generate all the files. Now that's done, and in the generate close mesh, I'll need to change the input folder to generated assets. Then the clothes name would be clothes / female casual suit 2, but I want to generate the fedora right now, so I'll change the clothes name, and to get the MH clothing reader, I'll need to change the folder to the mpfb2 plugin assets. Plus clothes name, and this will be the default material dot resource, and then it'll save it as the mesh dot resource, and I'll need to copy the find MH clothing function. So I'll copy the find MH clothing function from the GLB to mesh, and set the MH clothing path equal to find MH clothing from the folder, and then set the MH clothing reader from the found path. And this threw an error because in the previous file I needed to get the base directory, but in this one I'm already at the base directory, so I'll just remove that from the path and run it again. Hopefully it won't throw any errors this time. So this is because I changed the MH clothing reader to have vertex, weight, and offset instead of 0 through 8. So the v-index will be v-data vertex at I, and the weight will be v-data at weight at I, and then the offset has already been multiplied, so I can just add the v-data dot offset to the coordinates, and I'll run it again. So now it's printing out all of the shape key names, which is a good sign. So now it's generating all the shading, and I actually don't recommend that you do this yet because I'm going to do some testing on if this is even better. I think having all of the clothing pre-generated is going to be way too big in RAM, so it'll probably have to be generated at runtime based on the current shape keys anyway. So we probably won't have to run this except for like the eyes and tongue and teeth, anything that all of the models will share. And now in the closed demo, I want to add the generated Fedora mesh, and I'll rename it, reset the transform, and you can see that the blend shapes are available. So if you change the baby slider, it will make the hat smaller. So it'll work for all of those, and I want to attach it to the skeleton as well. And in the script, when I set the blend shape value, I'll set the fedora as well, and I want to set the fedora skin to the create skin from rest transforms. So now you can see that the fedora is attached to the character's head now. And if I play the animation, it stays where it's supposed to be. So that's all working. And now you can automatically import the clothing from your assets download directly into Godot without having to use Blender. So that's all good. And I'll go ahead and upload this to the repository, although I'm only keeping the generated assets that are needed for the closed demo. So I'll get rid of most of this, and if you want it, you'll have to regenerate it. But next time I'm going to work on a test world where I have both the pre-generated clothing with all the shape keys, and then also generating the positions at runtime. So I'll compare how long it takes with how much memory is being used, how much RAM. So, and mostly the problem is I just can't upload all of these closed meshes to GitHub. They're like 100 megs each. So pretty much I'll need to probably generate them at runtime, but I'll need to change the skeleton builder and the closed gen and all that. So I'll have to revert it back to how I had it before. But that's all for this time. Thank you for watching and have a great day.